Good morning, everyone. All right, Chris, we're tight for time, so I'm going to jump right into it. I brought your book for a nice little promo, year zero.
Thank you.
5-year presidency. And year zero, of course, your notion is that it's not a 4-year term. You should be thinking about it 1 year before you get there.
Yeah.
We're here. What are you thinking about from the Republican side?
Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about why I wrote the book, and then that's context for the answer. So, as David Axelrod mentioned in the last session, in North America, and my numbers are actually slightly worse than his, something like 75% of the country think that it's on the wrong track. And part of the reason for that is this fundamental distrust in our core institutions. So if you look at the measurement of every institution in the country, whether it's the courts or Congress or the media or now education system, basically it's all below water, all less than 50%. And you can do one of two things with that information. You can complain about it, or you can do something about it. And so my view in writing the book was I wanted to do something about an institution that I think is absolutely critical, which is the White House, which is something I know about having served there for 4 years, and basically think about how can you make the White House a more effective institution, because part of my belief is this distrust comes from ineffectiveness. So it's a book about how do you make the White House more effective, and to your point, part of that is to reconceptualize this thinking of how do you prepare to make it more effective. And I'm sort of a how person. A lot of people you'll hear about today are what people, and I'll talk a little bit about who in a second. But I'm a how person. How do you make things more effective? And that's what I did in the private sector, that's what I did in the public sector. And if you wait until you govern, it's too late. So you need to be thinking about something as complicated as the White House 1 year in advance. As you mentioned, we're now there. We're in the year zero of this particular election cycle. What's fascinating about this cycle is that we have two candidates who, regardless of who wins, will be serving their second term. And that hasn't happened since 1892, so a long, long time. It only has ever happened once before that presidents won a non-contiguous second term. So the book is bipartisan. It also applies to second terms as well as first terms. So the thing that I would say now, if I would looked at both campaigns and was to give them advice, and by the way, I'm not associated with the Trump campaign. I'm an observer, but I did serve in the first Trump. Second term presidencies almost always underperform. They underperform expectations and they underperform first terms. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. As I said, normally they're contiguous terms. One is one thing David mentioned, Axelrod mentioned, which is this hubris that comes with the first term, that we've got it all sorted out. But more particularly, there's this sense of consolidation that sets in. And if I was looking at the Biden administration, I would be saying, you really have to get out of the consolidation mode, because in any organization, whether it be public or private sector, once you start thinking about consolidation, you're going backwards. So he needs to reset, totally reset. The second thing, which is unusual for him, is he has had very high stability in his staff, which is unusual. But that means probably he has a cliff coming up, which is all of the people in his cabinet leaving as the first term finishes. So he's going to have a big personnel issue, opportunity as well, where he needs to not only refresh his agenda, refresh his people. So that's the sort of the Biden side of things. On the Trump side of year zero, ironically, he's in a slightly better position in that he has the knowledge of having served in one term without the burden of governing at the moment. And so one of the challenges of incumbency is you need to not only get re-elected, but you need to govern the country at the same time. Ex-President Trump doesn't have that same problem. So he comes in with the energy of a first term, but with the knowledge of having served with one term. His biggest challenge, which I talk about in the book, is this concept that has become prevalent in DC that you shouldn't, inverted commas, measure the drapes. That it's to be seen to be presumptive is to basically signal that there's something negative happening, that you've already counted the electoral victory. And I try and turn that concept on its head and say, no, what it shows is that you actually know how to run an organization properly. There's no organization in the world that would do a massive transformation like a change of government without planning for it. It's like doing a major acquisition and saying, oh, we'll worry about how we do it the day after we close. So his challenge is really around getting out of the DC sort of measuring the drapes syndrome and starting early. And I would expect him to announce his transition planning entity in the next little while. And the benefit that he has this particular cycle is he has two very strong institutions in North America, Heritage and American First Policy Institute, who have been doing a lot of the preliminary work for him already. So he's actually doing a lot of they have been doing a lot of the year zero concepts. So anyway, it's setting up this fascinating set of processes. But if you think about the how of the effectiveness of the White House, both administrations have really got to be thinking incredibly aspirationally about what they do in their second term. Otherwise, they will suffer the same curse as most second-term administrations and underperform.
So one of the sort of narratives that's making its way when you go down to the United States a lot is that Trump 2.0 will not be Trump 1.0.
Yep.
So when it comes to Trump 2.0, what can we expect?
Yeah, so look at the what and then the how and then the who, and everything in DC, politics in general, or in fact most organisations, there's normally three parts of the stool: the what, the how, and the who. So let's start with what. What actually will look a lot like Trump 1.0, and the good news, if you can think about it this way, maybe unpopular news, but good news in the sense of transparency, is Trump is very transparent about what he intends to do. And so the core planks of his agenda, which we can come back to, he has signalled very strongly, and broadly speaking, they're all consistent with what he did in the first term. Now, will he have the ability to do all of them in a second term? No, it's impossible to do as much as is on the total agenda. But the sort of core planks of the what, which, as I say, I'm happy to talk about, are very strong. I think the how is going to be quite different. It comes back to the point that I just made. In his first term, I think even the insiders would admit that he wasn't prepared, and he wasn't prepared properly. In the first 6 months, which I lived through when I was there, were pretty chaotic and disorganized. You are not going to have that this time. Assuming that he does what I think he will do, and again, I'm not involved, I'm just observing, which is be very systematic about his planning and build on the work that these two institutions have done that I mentioned, he will come out of the gates incredibly quickly. And I would think there is a reasonable chance that it's one of the most significant first 6 months of any presidency, certainly since Roosevelt, so in the last 100 years.
Is Canada in his sights?
Canada will be part of it because of the renegotiation of USMCA. It's not one of the, tariff and trade is definitely one of the what's, but I think China's going to be first and foremost in that. But the USMCA is definitely going to be part of it, and that comes to, if I can just talk about the third leg of the still, the who. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if Ambassador Bob Lighthizer is back in the administration. And if he is, he's one of the architects of the USMCA, and he will care very deeply about it. So it's not going to be day one issue, but it's going to be pretty high on the agenda.
Do you think the president is happy with the way the USMCA has been unfolding over the last few years since it came into effect? Or do you think there's a chance that he'll say, my great deal has been destroyed by this administration, we've got to do this all over again?
I don't have the latest figures, but he is laser focused on trade balances. That's basically,
yes.
He boils it down to
You're a commodities economy like us, though. Our imbalances tend to flow with the barrel price.
But my answer to the question would be what's happened since then.
Yes.
And if it hasn't significantly decreased, he will consider that to be at least a partial failure. So I don't know. I haven't talked to him about it. And again, I would say Lighthizer will be incredibly influential on his interpretation of it. But I would think that that will be one of the first and foremost things that I would look at. How has it changed in terms of growth in exports and growth in imports on both sides since it was signed?
Right. Now, you mentioned China. It's been a challenging issue for many, including Canada, that kind of got caught in between. Do you think the president's views on China have evolved in any way, shape, or form, or will it be a continuity of what we saw again in 1.0?
Very much a continuity, probably dialed up. And again, I don't think China lived up to a lot of the agreements that were made in the Trump 1.0 version of what was asked. And so I think President Trump will double down. And obviously President Biden has continued some of President Trump's tariffs and so forth from the first term. So we're not a situation where something went off, and it's got to come back on again. It went on, it stayed on, and then President Biden has actually dialed it up a bit. So I think you're going to see, and again, I'm not involved in the Trump administration, so this is just my speculation, not a Trump policy thing. I would say very early and very significant movement on China.
Okay. And the other question, of course, that comes up a lot, and I've heard this from our American business colleagues, that they feel that they may be in what they call a post-political environment in Washington. So when I asked what that means, the response was, well, look, heads we win, tails we win. If the Democrats get reelected, we get subsidies. If the Republicans get reelected, we get deregulation and tax cuts.
Yep.
We're good either way. So let's play the role that Donald Trump becomes president. What happens to the IRA?
I don't think it will be changed as much as what perhaps is speculated in some media areas. I would say it's always hard to change things in DC, and you can only do a certain amount. And I would say it's not going to be like right at the top of the list of things that he's really going to spend political capital on. Again, that's speculation on my part. Will there be some aspects of it that he will dial backwards, like subsidies on EVs? Yes. But he either does one of two things, which is he takes executive action to dial things back, which I would expect them to do, or he uses political capital to get legislative change around the IRA. That means there's only, again, presidents can only normally do one significant piece of legislation in the first 6 months, unless there's a crisis. Using political capital to significantly change the IRA sucks up so much oxygen. I would be surprised if that's high on his list.
The other issue that our ambassadors and others discussed was defense and defense spending in NATO. How do you think the president in the second term would come at that issue, particularly Canada and its role?
So people often ask me, how can you predict what the president's going to think? And I say, surprisingly to most people, he's incredibly predictable on some issues. And I often quote something, I won't remember it entirely off the top of my head, but he was interviewed with someone about defense spending in Europe, and he said, I can't believe that we subsidize all of these countries, we've been taken for the cleaners, this is just a rort on America. And I said, when do you think that interview was? And of course they say 6 years ago or something, it was 1987 with Larry King. So he's been talking about this for 35 years. This is a big issue. If you talk about something that would be high on the agenda, defense spending is absolutely it. And he is relentless about it. So again, exactly how that's going to play out, we can speculate on, but that will be a big issue for a second term.
When we spoke yesterday, you had mentioned to some of the people we were with the notion of signal versus noise. Maybe tell our audience about what that means with the president.
Yeah, with President Trump, you always have to look at the signal versus the noise, and how much is the true signal, how much is the noise. And the way he talks, everyone's seen it. And he talks in private very much how he talks in public, which is everything's biggest and the best and the grandest and the most, etc. But you have to think, what's the true signal that he's doing? And again, it comes back to which issues does he really fundamentally care about, because that's where the signal is strong. Other things are more for political gain or for negotiation purposes. So with every issue, there's a signal aspect to it and noise aspect to it, and part of my role as Deputy Chief of Staff is to sort out which was which so that we could make policy decisions and get on with it. But it's important to understand there's a component of both of those in virtually everything he says.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of political discussions that took place in the morning, but I run a business organization. Right. Our host, Darrell White, of course, is a prominent member of this organization, as well as our North American Working Group and so forth. What can business leaders do in this period, including in preparing for a potential transition either way? What role is there, if any, for businesses to contribute to that process and bring about the facts, if I can say?
Yeah, so a few thoughts. Firstly, I think it's the role of government to facilitate business, not the other way around. So it's part of our role to create an environment where business can do it. And again, I spent 4 years in the Trump administration, but I spent most of my life in the private sector. The first and foremost thing I would say is investment. The world's uncertain. You heard Ian talk about it, you've heard everyone talk about it, but you still got to invest. You can't just sit on your hands forever. And we're the beginning of, in my view, a 20-year trend that fundamentally both parties in the US have bought into, which is reshoring, industrial policy, rebuilding the middle class, rebuilding jobs. Now, the parties have different ways that they believe that can be carried out. One's much more orientated on sort of subsidies and involvement, the other on deregulation and loosening rules and so forth. So you can argue about the methods, but the basic instincts of both parties, I think, is very similar. So first and foremost, business should be investing, and North America, I think, is going to be an incredibly interesting place to invest. But the other thing I would say is, I know we're pretty much out of time, I had the most amazing 4 years of my life, even with all the turbulence and issues in the Trump administration. So if you really want to make a difference, and you want to make a difference to politics, volunteer and get into it.
Well, you led by example. Thank you for doing that. And again, ladies and gentlemen, the book is Year Zero, the 5-Year Presidency. Chris, thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you.